Thumb 8090, the city that crumbled under crime. What kind of city is born knowing it will never survive? What happens when a place is built not on laws, but on hunger, greed, and the certainty that violence will go unpunished? In 8090, Deadwood was no longer just a frontier town. It was a living experiment in how quickly human ambition can rot when gold becomes more valuable than life itself. Deadwood did not emerge slowly. It exploded. Its origin was not planned, negotiated, or authorized. It was illegal from the first day, built inside Native American territory in direct violation of treaties. Deadwood existed because thousands of men decided that gold mattered more than law. When the Black Hills Gold Rush ignited in the 1870s, tents became shacks. Shacks became saloons. And within a few years, an entire city stood where none was supposed to exist. By 1890, the surface story claimed Deadwood was civilizing. The truth beneath was far darker. Gold was the official reason people came. Crime was the real economy. By the late 1880s, the ease of gold was already disappearing, but the violence it created had become institutionalized. Deadwood attracted gamblers who cheated for a living, gunmen who sold protection, prostitutes who paid off police, and businessmen whose profits depended on keeping the city lawless just long enough to drain it dry. This was not chaos. It was a system that rewarded brutality and punished restraint. Every street carried an unspoken rule. Do not ask questions. People vanished regularly. A man who won too much at cards might not make it back to his room. A miner who struck a rich vein often found himself robbed or killed before sunrise. Bodies appeared in alleys, behind saloons, or were simply never found at all. Official records listed causes as accidents or drunken brawls. The reality was that Deadwood functioned as a grinder, consuming people and erasing evidence. By 1890, the city's reputation was already sealed, but the myth was still profitable. Newspapers painted Deadwood as wild but exciting, dangerous yet full of opportunity. That image lured in fresh victims. Newcomers believed they could outsmart the town. They rarely lasted long. The power structure was invisible but absolute. Saloon owners, gambling bosses, and corrupt men formed alliances that controlled outcomes. Justice was selective. Trials were rare. Convictions rarer still. The presence of law enforcement gave the illusion of order in practice. Sheriffs and marshals were often on payrolls. They never disclosed. A badge did not mean protection. It meant alignment. If a crime benefited the right people, it disappeared. If it threatened profits, punishment was swift and public. Deadwood did not fear violence. It depended on it. What made Deadwood especially dangerous was not the gunfights everyone talked about. It was the quiet crimes. Rigged games, poisoned drinks, fires set deliberately to destroy records or eliminate rivals. Businesses burned overnight, conveniently clearing debt or competition. Insurance fraud blended seamlessly with murder. Entire blocks could vanish in flames, and the next morning, reconstruction began as if nothing had happened. Fear became normalized. People learned to live with it, then learned not to notice it at all. That psychological erosion was Deadwood's real foundation. When fear becomes routine, morality collapses quickly. Men stopped intervening. Witnesses stopped speaking. Survival required silence. By the time 1890 arrived, Deadwood was no longer a frontier experiment. It was a closed ecosystem of crime feeding on itself. And yet, from the outside, Deadwood still sold a dream, opportunity, freedom, a place where a man could reinvent himself. That lie was Deadwood's final weapon, because every reinvention required someone else's destruction. Every fortune built that rested on losses no one recorded. The city did not sink suddenly. It sank slowly as crimes piled on top of crimes, until the weight became impossible to ignore. This is where the story truly begins, because to understand how Deadwood collapsed, you first have to understand how deeply crime was woven into its birth, how normal violence became, and why by 1890, the city was already past the point of saving. If this story is already changing the way you see Deadwood, take a moment to pause and think about what kind of place could survive like this for so long. Cities do not become violent by accident, and they do not collapse overnight. Understanding that pattern is the key to understanding what really happened here. I want to hear your thoughts. Do you believe Deadwood was doomed from the moment it was built? Or could it have taken a different path if power had shifted earlier? Leave a comment sharing your theory, or even a single word that describes what this city feels like to you after hearing this part. If this investigation is helping you see hidden layers of history that most stories ignore, make sure to leave a like and check if you are subscribed. That support is what allows these deep, research-driven stories to exist and continue uncovering what was buried for so long. By 1890, Deadwood was no longer pretending to become lawful. The performance had ended. What remained was a city that understood exactly what it was and chose to continue anyway. Crime was not a side effect of growth. It was the infrastructure. Every institution that should have restrained violence instead learned how to profit from it. And once that balance settled, Deadwood became something far more dangerous than a chaotic boomtown. It became predictable in the worst possible way. The idea of law in Deadwood existed mostly on paper. Ordinances were passed, courts were announced, sheriffs were elected, but enforcement followed money, not statutes. A murder committed by the wrong person could bring swift retaliation. The same crime committed by the right person vanished into silence. Trials were delayed. Witnesses disappeared. Evidence was lost in fires that no one investigated too closely. The system did not fail. It worked exactly as designed. Saloons were the city's true administrative centers. Deals were made over cards and whiskey, not desks and documents. Gambling houses ran protection rackets that extended far beyond cheating players. They controlled information. They decided who was safe, who was targeted, and who became an example. A man who crossed the wrong table could find himself framed for theft, beaten in the street, or simply erased. Deadwood perfected the art of plausible deniability long before the phrase existed. Every few months, a public killing reminded everyone where power actually lived. A body in the street was not chaos, it was communication. These deaths were rarely random. They were warnings delivered in flesh and blood. The city learned to read them. After a while, no one reacted. People stepped around corpses on their way to work. Shops reopened. Games continued. Violence lost its shock, and when violence loses shock, it multiplies. Behind the spectacle was a quieter layer of crime that destroyed more lives than gunfire ever did. Theft was constant. Claims were jumped. Deeds were forged. Minds changed ownership overnight through intimidation or fraud. A man could work a claim for months, only to lose it to paperwork created in a saloon backroom and validated by a judge who owed favors. By the time the victim realized what happened, resistance meant death or exile. Corruption spread downward as well. Small clerks learned to take bribes because everyone above them already did. Deputies enforced selectively because enforcement itself had become negotiable. Even religious leaders were pressured into silence. Speaking openly against the city's power brokers could mean arson, vandalism, or worse. The few who tried were quickly isolated. In Deadwood, isolation was often a death sentence. Around this time, a new kind of criminal arrived, not the outlaw passing through, but the professional parasite. Men who did not mine, did not gamble, did not even shoot unless necessary. They specialized in leverage, debt blackmail, information. They collected secrets and sold silence. A married man seen leaving a brothel, a merchant skimming from partners, a lawman taking bribes from both sides. These details became currency. Deadwood rewarded those who knew how to trade it. Every 300 or so words of Deadwood's daily life brought another reminder that the city was feeding on itself. Fires that conveniently erased records. Sudden bankruptcies that transferred assets upward. Suicides that solved inconvenient problems. Each event looked isolated. Together, they formed a pattern of extraction. Deadwood was not growing anymore. It was consuming what it had already built, and yet people kept arriving. That is the most unsettling part. They heard the stories and still came. Some believed they were smarter. Others believed they were harder. Many simply had nowhere else to go. Deadwood exploited that desperation expertly. It promised freedom, but what it offered was exposure. Once inside, leaving was harder than arriving. Debt, threats, and fear closed the exits. By the end of the decade, Deadwood had become a place where morality felt optional and survival felt temporary. People stopped asking whether something was right or wrong. They asked whether it was worth the risk. That mental shift is what finally doomed the city, because once crime becomes routine, it no longer shocks. And once it no longer shocks, it no longer stops. Deadwood did not collapse because of one event. It weakened because crime became ordinary. And ordinary evil is far more destructive than dramatic violence. By 1890, if you wanted to understand who truly controlled Deadwood, you did not look at City Hall. You walked into a saloon. That was where power lived, breathed, and enforced itself. These were not just places to drink or gamble. They were financial institutions, courts, intelligence hubs, and execution chambers disguised behind music and whiskey. Deadwood was not governed by law. It was governed by tables, cards, and back rooms. The saloons formed a network. Owners knew one another, protected one another, and coordinated when necessary. A problem in one establishment became a shared concern across the district. Cheating was expected, but it followed rules. Players who lost quietly were tolerated. Players who won too much attracted attention. The moment someone disrupted the balance, the system responded, sometimes with intimidation, sometimes with violence, often with both. Gambling was rigged with precision, decks were marked, dealers were trained to read reactions, lookouts watched for lamen who were not already paid off. A lucky streak could quickly turn into an accusation of cheating, whether true or not. Once accused, the burden of proof did not matter, the crowd decided, and crowds in Deadwood rarely decided in favor of outsiders. Bordellos were just as powerful. They controlled information in a way saloons could not. Men talked when they believed they were safe. They confessed debts, crimes, ambitions, and fears. Those confessions rarely stayed private. Prostitutes were often forced to report what they heard, either through direct threats or financial pressure. A secret whispered upstairs could determine a man's fate downstairs the next day. These establishments worked together. A gambler in debt could be guided to a brothel where his secrets were extracted. Those secrets could then be used to force him into bad deals, false confessions, or quiet disappearances. Deadwood perfected psychological control long before anyone named it. The city understood that fear was cheaper than bullets and more reliable. Every few weeks, an incident reminded everyone of this hierarchy. A man beaten publicly for refusing to pay a debt. A woman found dead after threatening to leave town with information. A saloon burned overnight, conveniently eliminating records and rivals while insurance money flowed upward. Fires were especially useful. They erased paper trails and allowed power to reset itself cleanly. Behind the spectacle was a rigid economy. Saloons paid lamen. Lamen protected saloons. Judges delayed cases until witnesses vanished. Newspaper editors softened language or avoided names entirely. Even preachers learned when to stop speaking. This was not random corruption. It was organized survival. Anyone who tried to operate outside the network found themselves isolated, then destroyed. By this stage, Deadwood no longer needed constant violence. Reputation did most of the work. People knew what happened to those who resisted. That knowledge shaped behavior. Newcomers learned quickly. Smile, drink, lose quietly. Do not ask questions. The city trained its victims efficiently. Every 300 to 400 words of daily life brought another quiet. Reminder: a miner selling his claim far below value after a private conversation, a merchant closing shop suddenly and leaving town overnight, a gambler switching tables and never returning. These moments looked small. Together, they were extraction points. Deadwood was draining itself through controlled exploitation. What made this system so stable was participation. Even those harmed by it often defended it. Saloons provided food, warmth, and community. Bordellos provided companionship in a harsh world. For many, these places felt safer than the streets. That illusion kept people loyal long after it should have collapsed. But loyalty built on fear does not last forever. As gold production slowed and money tightened, competition between these power centers intensified, alliances fractured, betrayals increased. The very system that kept Deadwood functioning began to cannibalize itself. When profits shrink, corruption turns inward. By the time Deadwood reached the end of the century, its heart was hollow. The saloons still glowed. Music still played. Cards still hit the tables. But beneath the surface, trust was gone. Everyone was watching everyone else. And a city that lives like that cannot survive for long. By the time Deadwood reached 8090, the question was no longer whether the city had law enforcement. The question was who that law actually served. Badges existed, courts operated, arrests were made, but justice in Deadwood was not blind. It was selective, transactional, and deeply compromised. The men meant to restrain violence had learned how to monetize it instead. Sheriffs and marshals in Deadwood walked a dangerous line. Officially, they represented order. Unofficially, they survived by choosing sides. A lawman who tried to enforce the law evenly rarely lasted long. He was isolated, undermined, or removed through quieter means. Sometimes a false charge, sometimes a staged accident, sometimes a warning delivered so clearly that resignation felt like the only rational choice. Many lawmen accepted bribes openly. Others were paid indirectly. Free drinks, forgiven debts, shares in gambling operations, protection for family members. The system rarely required explicit agreement. Everyone understood the rules. Protect certain interests and you stay alive. Disrupt them and you become a problem that needs solving. Justice became apaforen. Arrests were made when the crowd demanded blood or when a killing became too public to ignore. Trials followed, but outcomes were predictable. Witnesses recanted. Evidence disappeared. Jurors were pressured. Judges delayed proceedings until interest faded. A man could commit murder in plain sight and still walk free if his connections were strong enough. At the same time, Deadwood relied heavily on private justice. When the legal system stalled, citizens took matters into their own hands. Vigilante groups formed quickly and dissolved just as fast. Sometimes they acted out of genuine fear. Other times they were tools used by powerful figures to remove rivals without official fingerprints. A lynching could look like public outrage while serving private interests. These moments sent powerful signals. Violence did not need to be constant. It needed to be memorable. A single hanging could silence dozens of potential challengers. People learned when to speak and when to disappear into the crowd. Silence became a survival skill. Every few months, a lawman would be killed. Newspapers framed these deaths as tragic consequences of frontier danger. The truth was often simpler. A badge holder had crossed an invisible line. Perhaps he enforced the wrong warrant. Perhaps he refused to bribe. Perhaps he aligned with a rival faction. His death restored balance. The city moved on without reflection. Behind the scenes, paperwork became a weapon. Arrest records altered. Warrants delayed. Property seized under questionable authority. Legal tools designed to protect citizens were repurposed to strip them of rights. A man could lose his business, his claim, or his freedom without ever understanding how it happened. By the time he realized, it was too late to fight back. This constant manipulation eroded any remaining belief in fairness. People stopped reporting crimes. Why risk retaliation when nothing would change? Instead, they learned to negotiate privately, settle disputes quietly, or leave town entirely. Deadwood began losing not just its innocence, but its capable people. Those with options escaped, those without stayed and adapted. Every 300 to 400 words of Deadwood's daily rhythm brought another reminder of how fragile justice had become. A killer freed on technicalities, a debtor jailed indefinitely, a rival fined into ruin while another walked untouched. Each decision looked isolated. Together, they formed a legal landscape that favored predators. What made this especially destructive was how normal it felt. Children grew up watching law bend and break without consequence. New arrivals learned the lesson quickly. Authority did not protect you. It watched you. Sometimes it hunted you. Trust disappeared, replaced by caution and calculation. Deadwood did not fall because it lacked law. It fell because law became another instrument of crime. Once that line was crossed, there was no clear path back. Every attempt at reform threatened too many interests. Every honest effort invited retaliation. Not all of Deadwood's violence announced itself with gunfire. By 8090, the most destructive crimes were often the ones no one saw. The ones that left no bodies in the street and no headlines in the papers. These were the quiet crimes, the disappearances. The deaths explained away as accidents, illness, or bad luck. This invisible violence did more to hollow out the city than any public shootout ever could. People vanished in Deadwood with unsettling regularity. A miner would leave a saloon late at night and never be seen again. gambler would pack his things, tell no one, and disappear before dawn. A woman working in a brothel would simply stop showing up, her room cleaned out within hours. Official explanations were always available. They went back east, they moved on, they drank themselves to death somewhere else. The city accepted these stories because questioning them was dangerous. Many of these disappearances were deliberate removals. Men who owed too much, people who knew too much, witnesses who talked too freely. Deadwood had no shortage of places to hide a body. Mine shafts ran deep and unmarked. Forests surrounded the town. Rivers carried evidence away without complaint. Once someone was gone, proof became irrelevant. The absence itself was the message. Deaths were often disguised. A poisoned drink could look like sudden illness. A fall down a stairway could be ruled an accident. A fire could erase both the victim and the circumstances of their death. Coroners, when they existed, rarely, pushed beyond surface explanations. They understood the risks. An autopsy that raised questions could make the examiner the next problem to be solved. Even suicide became a convenient label. Despair was common in a city built on broken promises. When someone was found dead under suspicious circumstances, declaring it self-inflicted closed the case quickly. No investigation, no testimony, no retaliation. Families rarely challenged these conclusions. Doing so required power they did not have. The most chilling aspect of this invisible violence was how routine it became. People adjusted, they avoided forming close ties, they stopped asking where neighbors had gone. Grief became private. Silence became public policy. The city taught its residents that survival depended on emotional distance. Every few hundred words of Deadwood's lived experience carried another quiet warning. A claim quietly transferred after its owner vanished. A room reassigned hours after a death. A ledger rewritten after a fire. Each act reinforced the same lesson. Lives were disposable. Profit was not. This culture of erasure created an environment where fear operated without spectacle. You did not need to see violence to feel it. You felt it in conversations that ended abruptly, in doors that stayed locked, in people who never used real names. The city became a place where trust was irrational and memory was dangerous. What made these crimes especially effective was their deniability. Without bodies, without witnesses willing to speak, there was nothing to prosecute. Lawmen could claim ignorance. Judges could claim lack of evidence. Newspapers could claim rumor. Deadwood's violence thrived in the gaps between what was known and what could be proven. Over time, this invisible brutality reshaped behavior. People stopped investing in the future. Why build something permanent in a place where permanence invited attention? Businesses became temporary. Relationships became transactional. Even hope became cautious. Deadwood was no longer a place where lives were built. It was a place where time was survived. By 1890, the city was bleeding quietly. Its population shifted constantly, masking the loss. New arrivals replaced the missing. The numbers looked stable. The soul was not. Deadwood was losing its memory, one disappearance at a time. Before we continue, I want your thoughts. Do you believe these silent crimes were more damaging than the public violence everyone remembers? Or are they impossible to separate? Leave a comment with your perspective or a word that captures how this unseen violence feels to you. By the early 1890s, Deadwood had entered a new phase of decay, one that was far more dangerous than open lawlessness. The gold that once justified the chaos was thinning out, but the habits it created remained fully intact. Greed did not fade with the veins in the hills. It turned inward. And when a city built on extraction runs out of something to extract, it begins consuming itself. The mines were no longer producing easy wealth. Claims that once promised fortune now barely covered costs. Investors grew impatient. Workers grew desperate. This shift changed the psychology of the town. Violence became less impulsive and more calculated. When money is abundant, crime is reckless. When money tightens, crime becomes strategic. Deadwood's social structure started collapsing from the inside. Mine owners cut wages or abandoned operations altogether, leaving workers stranded with debt and no alternatives. Merchants raised prices to compensate for fewer customers. Gambling houses became more aggressive, squeezing players harder, rigging games more blatantly, pushing losses beyond recovery. Every transaction carried more pressure than before. This is where blood truly replaced gold as the fuel of the city. Disputes that once might have been settled quietly now ended in violence because there was nothing left to negotiate with. Everything had nothing to lose. Desperation breeds recklessness, and Deadwood became saturated with it. Families began leaving. Those who had managed to save anything fled quietly, selling properties at a loss just to escape. What remained was a population increasingly made up of men with no roots and no future plans. That kind of demographic shift matters. A city without families stops imagining tomorrow. It lives entirely in the present moment, and the present moment in Deadwood was brutal. Every 300 to 400 words of daily life brought another sign of internal collapse. Businesses turning on longtime partners, former allies testifying against each other, then vanishing. Saloons that once cooperated now competing violently over shrinking profits. Trust disintegrated. Paranoia replaced it. The moral decay followed the economic one closely. Acts that once felt shocking became necessary. Theft became survival. Violence became negotiation. Betrayal became insurance. Deadwood taught its residents that loyalty was a liability and mercy was a mistake. That lesson spread quickly. Even the city's physical environment reflected the rot. Buildings fell into disrepair. Streets became dirt and mud again as maintenance stopped. Fires increased, some accidental, many not. Insurance fraud surged as owners realized destruction paid better than operation. Each burned structure left scars that never fully healed. What made this stage irreversible was exhaustion. People were tired of fighting, tired of fearing, tired of watching their neighbors disappear. A city can survive violence for a time. It cannot survive hopelessness. By the time Deadwood reached this point, it no longer believed in its own future. Gold had brought people together. Blood drove them apart. And once that transition was complete, collapse was only a matter of time, not because of one disaster, but because the city no longer had the will to resist its own worst instincts. By the time Deadwood reached its final years of the 1890s, collapse was no longer theoretical. It was physical. Fires tore through entire blocks. Businesses folded overnight. Money vanished faster than it arrived. What had once been a violent but functional system now unraveled under pressure. And the city's destruction came not from one disaster, but from a chain of them feeding off each other. Fire became Deadwood's most convenient weapon. Officially, these were accidents. Faulty stoves, careless lanterns, overcrowded, wooden buildings pressed together without proper planning. Unofficially, many fires were solutions. They erased debt, destroyed records, removed rivals. Insurance payments flowed where profits no longer could. Whole sections of the city burned, and with them the paper trail of crimes that had accumulated for decades. Rebuilding was faster than reflection. Charred ruins were cleared. New structures rose almost immediately. Cheaper, flimsier, more temporary. The urgency was not to create stability, but to resume extraction. Each reconstruction carried less care, less permanence, less belief. Deadwood rebuilt because stopping meant admitting failure. At the same time, the economy collapsed from multiple directions. Mining revenues shrank further. Investors pulled out. Banks tightened credit or disappeared entirely. Workers who had once tolerated danger for the chance of wealth now faced only risk without reward. Crime increased sharply, but its quality changed. More theft, more desperation, less control. Every 300 to 400 words of lived experience added another fracture. A saloon owner murdered by former partners. A fire that mysteriously spared only one building. A shipment of supplies stolen before reaching town. These were not random misfortunes. They were symptoms of a system turning on itself. Natural disasters compounded the damage. Harsh winters isolated Deadwood, cutting off supply lines. Floods damaged roads and mining operations. Disease spread quickly in crowded, unsanitary conditions. Illness took lives quietly, but efficiently. The city lacked the infrastructure or the will to respond effectively. Population decline accelerated. Those who could leave did. Those who stayed were often trapped by debt, fear, or lack of options. Deadwood hollowed out. Businesses closed earlier. Streets emptied faster. Nightfall came sooner, not because of the sun, but because people no longer wanted to be outside. The city's leadership fractured completely. Power struggles turned violent. Alliances dissolved. Lawmen resigned or were killed. Judges fled. There was no longer a center holding Deadwood together. What remained was inertia and habit. People continued routines that no longer served any purpose. Fires, bankruptcies, and violence reinforced each other. Each disaster made the next more likely. Each collapse reduced the city's ability to recover. Deadwood entered a downward spiral where survival itself became temporary. By this stage, the city was not waiting for a final blow. It had already absorbed too many. The end would not be dramatic. It would be quiet. Businesses would close, streets would empty, and the place that once roared with ambition would fade into something people spoke about in the past tense. As Deadwood declined, something more unsettling than violence or fire began to take shape. Silence. By the late 1890s, the city was no longer just collapsing. It was being edited. Stories disappeared. Records vanished. Names were quietly removed from memory. What survived was not the full truth of Deadwood, but a version that powerful interests found safer to leave behind. Newspapers softened their language. Murders became incidents. Disappearances became departures. Corruption was reframed as frontier necessity. Editors understood the limits of curiosity. Printing the wrong name could mean a smashed press, a burned office, or a quiet warning delivered after dark. So stories were trimmed. Details were omitted. Deadwood's most damaging truths were buried in plain sight. Court records followed the same pattern. Documents went missing. Cases were left unresolved. Testimonies were never transcribed. In some instances, entire ledgers vanished after fires or floods that arrived at remarkably convenient times. Without records, accountability dissolved. Without accountability, history itself became negotiable. Families played their part as well. Survivors often chose silence over truth. Admitting how someone really died could invert retaliation or social isolation. It was safer to accept official explanations, no matter how thin. Over time, these accepted lies hardened into community memory. Children grew up hearing stories that skipped the darkest chapters entirely. The selective forgetting reshaped Deadwood's identity. The city slowly reinvented itself, not as a cautionary tale, but as a romantic relic of the Wild West. Gunfighters became legends. Saloons became colorful backdrops. Violence became entertainment. The human cost faded into abstraction. The crimes that destroyed lives were repackaged as folklore. Every 300 to 400 words of Deadwood's remaining narrative revealed another layer of distortion. A killer remembered as a rogue hero. A corrupt lawman remembered as a tough enforcer. A vanished woman remembered only as a rumor. These revisions were not accidental. They were necessary for Deadwood to be remembered at all. Tourism, when it eventually arrived, depended on this sanitized version. Visitors wanted danger without consequence, drama without grief. They wanted stories that thrilled, not truths that unsettled. The city obliged. It preserved buildings and performances, not accountability. What was lost was harder to reconstruct than what burned. This rewriting had long-term consequences. When a city hides its crimes, it also hides its lessons. Deadwood became a warning stripped of its warning. People remembered what happened, but not why it mattered. The cycle that destroyed it was left intact, ready to repeat elsewhere under a different name. By the time Deadwood settled into myth, its real victims were gone from the story entirely. Their lives did not fit the narrative that survived. Silence won, and silence, more than violence, ensured that Deadwood's collapse could be misunderstood for generations. There came a moment when Deadwood stopped pretending it could recover. It was not marked by a single fire, a final murder, or a dramatic announcement. It arrived quietly, almost politely, when people realized the city no longer offered even the illusion of opportunity. By the late 1890s, Deadwood had crossed an invisible line. It was no longer dangerous because it was alive. It was dangerous because it was dying. The dream that once pulled people in collapsed from exhaustion. Gold no longer promised escape. Crime no longer promised profit. Violence no longer commanded fear. It became background noise. When danger becomes ordinary, it loses its power to control behavior, and that is when systems fail. Deadwood had relied on fear to function. Once fear stopped working, nothing replaced it. Businesses closed, not with gunfire, but with locked doors. Signs were taken down. Equipment was sold or abandoned. Entire streets fell silent. The saloons still opened, but fewer lamps were lit. Fewer cards hit the tables. Fewer voices filled the rooms. The energy that once defined Deadwood drained away, leaving behind routine without purpose. People who stayed did so out of necessity, not belief. Some were too poor to leave. Others were too entangled in debt, reputation, or fear of what waited elsewhere. Many simply did not know how to exist outside a place that had taught them survival through suspicion. Deadwood shaped its residents, then abandoned them. Every 300 to 400 words of lived experience brought another sign of abandonment. Churches struggled to gather congregations. Schools closed for lack of children. Cemeteries expanded faster than neighborhoods. The city's age profile skewed sharply toward the desperate and the transient. A place without children is a place without a future. What replaced ambition was superstition. Deadwood became known as cursed, a bad place, a city that swallowed people. This belief served the function. It allowed those who left to distance themselves emotionally. It allowed those who stayed to explain suffering without assigning responsibility. Calling a place cursed is easier than admitting it was built to fail. At this stage, even crime lost structure. Organized corruption gave way to opportunistic survival. Theft replaced schemes. Violence became impulsive again, but without the resources to sustain it. The predators that once controlled Deadwood moved on, leaving behind only scavengers. A city can survive predators. It rarely survives scavengers. The final transformation was psychological. Deadwood stopped imagining itself as temporary. It stopped planning. Repairs were no longer made. Investments were no longer considered. People lived day to day, assuming tomorrow would look like today, or worse. That assumption became self-fulfilling. Deadwood did not disappear overnight. It lingered, but linger is not the same as living. By the time outsiders began calling it a ghost of its former self, the city had already accepted that identity internally. It had become a place people remembered, even while standing inside it. Deadwood did not vanish the way cities in legends do. It did not collapse into ash or sink beneath the earth in a single moment. Its end was slower, heavier, and far more disturbing. The city was buried under the accumulated weight of its own crimes, every murder left unresolved, every disappearance ignored, every lie accepted as truth, added another layer of pressure until the structure beneath could no longer hold. What remained after the collapse was not emptiness, but residue. Buildings still stood, streets still existed, names still appeared on maps, but the purpose was gone. Deadwood survived physically while dying socially. That is the most dangerous kind of death for a city, because it looks alive long after it has stopped functioning. The legacy Deadwood left behind was carefully curated. Gunfights became stories, criminals became characters, suffering became atmosphere, the holocaust of lives broken quietly, the families erased without explanation, the systems designed to exploit and discard people were pushed to the margins. Deadwood became entertainment because confronting its truth was uncomfortable. Every 300 to 400 words of its remaining narrative revealed the same pattern repeated elsewhere in history. Places built on extraction without restraint. Power structures that reward cruelty, silence, and force through fear. When those elements align, collapse is inevitable. Deadwood was not unique. It was early. What truly sank the city was not gold running out, nor fire, nor even violence. It was normalization. Crime became routine. Corruption became expected. Death became background noise. Once a society accepts those conditions, reform becomes almost impossible. There's nothing dramatic left to react to. Deadwood serves as a warning, disguised as a legend. It shows how quickly freedom without accountability becomes predation. How law without integrity becomes another weapon. How a city can destroy itself while believing it is simply surviving. Even today, traces of Deadwood's mindset appear whenever profit is allowed to override humanity, whenever silence is rewarded more than truth, whenever systems protect themselves instead of people. That is a real legacy. Not the buildings, not the stories, but the pattern. And that pattern does not end on its own. It only ends when it is recognized. You stayed until the end. It means this story resonated with you on a deeper level. Deadwood was not just a city that collapsed. It was a warning written in human lives, silence, and forgotten crimes. If this investigation made you see history differently, take a moment to support the channel. Subscribe so you do not miss the next stories that uncover what history tried to hide. Leave a like to show that this kind of deep, uncomfortable truth matters. I also want to hear from you. Comment the word Deadwood if you reached the end, and share your own theory. Do you believe Deadwood destroyed itself, or was it always designed to fail from the beginning? And before you go, watch the next video appearing on your screen now. It continues this journey into the dark histories of cities that vanished, collapsed, or were erased for reasons far more disturbing than most people realize.